That's a commercial vehicle, Mr. Barnes. It has no place in our community. Have it gone in 10 minutes, or I'm having it towed at your expense." The words hung in the humid afternoon air, thick with the cloying scent of freshly cut and, apparently, minutely regulated grass. Karen, the self-appointed queen of Oakwood Preserve and president of its homeowners association, stood on the pristine sidewalk bordering my driveway, a stark monument to suburban tyranny. She was a woman in her late 50s, built like a defensive lineman and poured into a luridly floral pink tracksuit that strained at the seams with every self-important breath she took. In one hand she held a clipboard, the scepter of her petty kingdom, and in the other, a phone, her finger hovering over the screen like a vulture circling its prey. Her eyes, small and hard, were fixed on my truck. It wasn't just a truck. It was a piece of my history, a 1978 Ford F-250 Ranger that I had spent the better part of 2 years restoring. Every inch of its gleaming midnight blue paint, every bolt on its rebuilt 460 V8 engine was a testament to patience and precision. Lessons learned over 20 years as an Army combat engineer. It was parked perfectly centered in my own driveway, tires not so much as kissing the public walkway, a work of art that happened to also be able to haul a mountain. To Karen, however, it was a blight, a violation, an affront to the beige-tinted, soul-crushingly uniform aesthetic she brutally enforced. Her accusation was absurd. "Karen, this is my personal vehicle," I said, my voice deliberately low and even. I'd learned in far more dangerous situations that the first one to yell is the first one to lose control. "It's registered to me at this address. It's parked on my property," she scoffed, a sound like air leaking from a punctured tire. "It has a company name on the door, Mr. Barnes, Valor Towing and Recovery." That makes it a commercial vehicle per Section C, Paragraph 11 of the HOA covenants. No commercial vehicles shall be parked in public view overnight. It's been here for 3 nights. She tapped the clipboard with a perfectly manicured nail. "I have pictures." My jaw tightened. The lettering was a tribute, not an advertisement. It was a small, discreet nod to the business I co-owned with my best friend and former platoon sergeant Dale. I was a silent partner, the 51% majority owner, an investment for my retirement. The truck was my personal project, a hobby. It had never towed a single vehicle for the company. Explaining this nuance to Karen would be like explaining quantum physics to a garden gnome. "It's not a work truck, Karen. It's a classic restoration." "The rules are the rules," she chirped, a smug smile playing on her lips. She was enjoying this, the power, the confrontation, the public display of her authority for the benefit of any neighbors peeking through their blinds. "You were warned about the mailbox flag last month. You were fined for the unapproved garden decorations 2 weeks ago. This is strike 3. The truck goes, or I make it go." She held up her phone. 10 minutes, Mr. Barnes. The clock is ticking." I didn't move. I simply stood on my porch, arms crossed, and watched her. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable for her, but familiar to me. I had sat in far worse silences, waiting for much more serious things than a tow truck. A minute passed, then 2. Her smugness began to curdle into impatience. "Fine," she snapped, her voice shrill. "Have it your way." She jabbed at her phone with her thumb, putting it to her ear. "Yes, this is Karen Prescott from the Oakwood Preserve HOA. I need a truck dispatched to 112 Willow Lane immediately. We have an unauthorized commercial vehicle that needs to be removed. Yes, a Ford pickup. Bill it to the homeowner, of course." She hung up and gave me a triumphant look, a look that said, "Checkmate." If you've ever had a nightmare neighbor or a power-tripping HOA board, hit that subscribe button and let me know in the comments where you're watching from. You're not going to want to miss how this ends. The next 10 minutes were a masterclass in suburban theater. Karen stood her ground on the sidewalk, a sentry guarding the neighborhood's virtue from my offensive piece of classic American steel. I remained on my porch, a silent observer in this ridiculous drama. The hum of a heavy-duty diesel engine grew louder, and soon, one of the biggest wreckers in our fleet rounded the corner. It was a gleaming monster of a machine, its chrome grille catching the afternoon sun. The driver, a young man named Cody who I'd met a few times at the company barbecue, hopped out. He was a good kid, a Marine veteran we'd hired right out of his service. He looked from the massive wrecker to my pristine F-250, then to me standing on the porch, and finally to Karen, who was pointing a commanding finger. "That one," she ordered. "Hook it up." Cody looked deeply uncomfortable. He walked over to me, keeping his voice low. "Mr. Barnes, sir, I got the dispatch. Is this for real?" "It's real, Cody," I said calmly. She called it in. "But this is your truck," he whispered, his eyes wide with confusion. "I know." Karen, impatient with the delay, stomped closer. "What's the problem? Do your job." Cody looked at Karen, then back at me, a silent question in his eyes. I gave him a slight, almost imperceptible nod. He pulled out his work phone, the one connected directly to the dispatch and management line. "Yeah, Dale," he said, turning away from Karen. "It's Cody. I'm at that Oakwood Preserve job. Yeah, it's Mr. Barnes's classic Ford. No, I'm not kidding. The HOA lady is here. She's telling me to tow it." There was a pause. I could almost hear Dale's explosive reaction through the phone. Cody held the phone away from his ear for a second, then put it back. "Okay, yeah, I'll tell her." He hung up and faced Karen, his expression now firm, his military bearing returning. "Ma'am," he said, his voice respectful but unyielding. "My boss, the owner of the company, has given me a direct order. I am not to touch this vehicle." Karen's face, which had been a mask of smug satisfaction, collapsed into a canvas of pure fury. "Your boss? I am the one who called you. I have a contract with your company." "Yes, ma'am," Cody said, standing his ground, "but my boss is the 49% owner, and he just got off the phone with the 51% owner who is standing right there." He pointed directly at me. "And the majority owner says his truck isn't going anywhere." My wife, Sarah, and I had chosen Oakwood Preserve for the quiet. After 2 decades in the Army, deploying to places where quiet was a luxury and peace was a prayer, all I wanted was a place to put down roots. We wanted a good school for our 15-year-old daughter, Lily, a yard for Sarah's landscaping ambitions, and a 3-car garage for my projects. The promotional brochure had painted a picture of suburban paradise, tree-lined streets, a sparkling community pool, and friendly neighbors who waved as you drove by. The reality, we soon discovered, was a meticulously curated diorama governed by a 3-inch thick binder of covenants, conditions, and restrictions enforced with religious zeal by its high priestess, Karen Prescott. The first sign of trouble was subtle, almost comical. A week after we moved in, a crisp envelope appeared taped to our front door. Inside, a professionally printed violation notice, complete with a grainy photo, informed us that our mailbox flag was non-compliant. The standard issue flag was black. Ours, a small patriotic gesture, was a tiny American flag. The notice cited a bylaw requiring absolute uniformity in all curbside apparatuses. There was no fine, just a courtesy warning. I sighed, swapped the flag, and filed the notice in a new folder I labeled HOA. It felt petty, but I was new here, and my mission was peace, not conflict. I chose to see it as an endearing quirk of a community that valued order. That was my first mistake. The second infraction came 2 weeks later. I had bought Lily a new basketball hoop and set it up at the edge of our driveway. The next morning, another envelope. This time, it was a $50 fine. Our hoop, according to Karen's laser measuring tape and another grainy photo, was positioned 6 inches closer to the street than the approved setback of 10 feet from the curb. The notice helpfully included a diagram. I paid the fine, moved the hoop 6 inches, and added the documents to my growing file. I was beginning to feel less like a homeowner and more like a probationary tenant. It was during this time that I met Arthur Kensington. He was a widower in his 80s, a retired history professor who had lived in Oakwood Preserve since it was built. He was out walking his beagle one evening as I was meticulously measuring the distance of my basketball hoop from the curb. He paused, a wry smile on his face. "Getting the lay of the land, are we?" he asked, his voice a gentle scholarly rumble. "Just trying to stay compliant, Arthur," I replied, showing him the tape measure. He chuckled, a dry, knowing sound. "Ah, yes, the gospel according to Karen. Let me give you some friendly advice, son. This isn't about order, it's about control. She feeds on it." He leaned in conspiratorially. "She drove the Millers out last year. A lovely family. Their crime? They installed a swing set for their grandkids that was painted cedar brown instead of the approved redwood brown. A war of 1,000 fines. They finally gave up and sold." He patted my shoulder. "You seem like a man who knows how to stand his ground. Just be warned, you're not fighting the rules. You're fighting her." Arthur's words stuck with me. They cast a shadow over the manicured lawns and identical mailboxes. This wasn't a community, it was a territory. And I had just been marked as a threat to the Alpha. The business, Valor Towing and Recovery, had been my transition plan back into civilian life. Dale, my old platoon sergeant, was a wizard with logistics and machinery, but a disaster with paperwork and finances. I was the opposite. We pooled our resources. He took a salary in 49% of the company, running the day-to-day operations. I took the 51% majority stake and handled the strategy, the books, and the long-term growth, mostly from my home office. It was the perfect arrangement. We made it a point to hire veterans, giving them a solid place to land after their service. The small, tasteful lettering on my personal truck was a point of pride, a tribute to the men and women who worked for us. I never imagined it would become the flashpoint in a war for my own driveway. Karen's humiliated retreat after Cody refused to tow my truck was not a victory. It was merely the end of the first skirmish. As I watched her storm back to her house, her pink tracksuit a blur of indignation, I knew this was far from over. Arthur's warning echoed in my mind. I wasn't fighting the rules. I was fighting her. And she had just been publicly challenged on her own turf. The war of 1,000 fines was about to begin in earnest. That night Dale called me, his voice a mix of amusement and concern. "So you finally poked the bear, huh, Jack?" "Looks that way," I said, looking out my window at the F-250, which seemed to stand prouder under the porch light. "She's not going to let this go," he warned. "These HOA tyrants are a special breed, worse than any company commander we ever had." "I know," I said, a grim sense of resolve settling over me. "That's why I need you to do something for me, Dale. Start a file. Document every single communication from the Oakwood Preserve HOA. Every call, every email. We're going to need it." The battle for my truck was over. The war for my home had just begun. The aftermath of the failed towing was a quiet, unnerving storm. There was no immediate confrontation, no angry phone call. Instead, the assault came through the mail slot, a silent, daily barrage of white envelopes. Karen had exchanged her public bluster for the cold, impersonal weapon of bureaucracy. The violation notices began arriving with relentless frequency, each one more absurd than the last. My lawn, which I mowed every Saturday to a respectable 2 inches, was cited for being in excess of the 2.5-inch maximum height restriction. The notice included a photo taken at ground level where a single blade of grass might have been a millimeter too tall. Fine, $75. A tiny decorative solar light Sarah had placed next to a rose bush, a gift from our daughter Lily, was deemed an unapproved landscape modification. Fine, $50. The day after a small windstorm, a notice appeared for failure to remove natural debris, referring to a few scattered leaves on our front walkway that hadn't yet been swept. Fine, $25. It was a death by 1,000 paper cuts, a deliberate campaign of harassment designed to wear us down, to make living in our own home an exercise in constant anxiety. Each fine was a psychological blow. Sarah, who had poured her heart into making our new house a home, grew withdrawn and stressed. "This is insane, Jack," she said one evening. her hands trembling as she held up 3 new notices that had arrived that day. We can't live like this, constantly looking over our shoulder. Maybe Arthur was right. Maybe we should just sell. We were sitting at the kitchen table, the offending envelope spread out between us like a declaration of war. I looked at her face, drained and unhappy, and I felt a surge of cold anger. This was my home. This was the peace I had earned. I would not be driven from it by a petty tyrant in a tracksuit. No, I said, my voice firm. We're not running. I didn't run from real threats, and I'm not running from this. This is a mission, Sarah. The objective is to secure our peace. We just need a new strategy. I took all the notices, the photos, the threatening letters, and the copies of the checks I'd sent to pay the fines, all marked paid under protest, and laid them out. My military training kicked in. This was an enemy engaging in asymmetrical warfare. I needed to gather intelligence, build a case, and choose my own ground to fight on. The first step was reconnaissance. I started attending the monthly HOA meetings held in the sterile beige community clubhouse. The meetings were a farce of democracy. Karen presided from a table at the front, flanked by 2 loyal board members, a timid woman named Carol, and a grumpy man named Bob who seemed to be permanently asleep. Karen controlled the entire proceeding. She held the only microphone, interpreted the minutes to her advantage, and used a labyrinth of procedural rules to shut down any resident who dared to ask a difficult question. I watched as a young mother tried to ask why the playground equipment was rusty and broken. Karen cut her off, stating that new capital expenditures were not on the approved agenda and the topic could be submitted in writing for consideration at the next quarterly budget review. The mother sat down, defeated. I saw other residents exchange frustrated glances but remain silent, their fear of being the next target palpable. At my second meeting, I decided to test the waters. During the open forum, I stood up and waited to be recognized. "Mr. Barnes," Karen said, her voice dripping with disdain, "you have 3 minutes." I didn't address the truck or my personal fines. I kept it general. "I have a question regarding the enforcement of Covenant 7B, which pertains to lawn maintenance," I said calmly. "I've noticed several properties, including one at 148 Crimson Court, that have significant weeds and are clearly in violation for several weeks, yet the issue persists. Could you clarify the board's process for consistent and fair enforcement for all residents?" 148 Crimson Court was the home of Karen's cousin, a fact I had learned from Arthur. The question was a carefully placed probe. A murmur went through the room. Karen's face tightened. "All violations are handled with due process, Mr. Barnes," she said stiffly. "We do not discuss specific properties or enforcement actions in a public forum. It's a privacy issue." "I'm not asking for specifics," I countered. "I'm asking for an explanation of the process to ensure it is applied equally to all homeowners, not just a select few." "Your 3 minutes are up," she snapped, her eyes flashing. "Next." She pointed to someone else, and I was forced to sit down. But the point had been made. I had publicly highlighted the hypocrisy, and though no one spoke up to support me, I saw the nods of agreement. I saw the flicker of hope in the eyes of the young mother who had been shut down earlier. After the meeting, Arthur sought me out. "A direct hit," he said, a glint in his eye, "but you've painted a bigger target on your back." "I know," I replied, "but now they know I'm not just going to sit here and take it. It's time to go on the offensive." My file folder was no longer just labeled HOA. I had retitled it Operation Enduring Peace. The intelligence gathering phase was over. It was time to plan the counterattack. The first volley in my counteroffensive wasn't a rocket. It was a registered letter. My time in the military had taught me the immense power of a well-documented paper trail. If Karen wanted to weaponize bureaucracy, I would turn that weapon back on her. As a homeowner and member of the HOA, I had a legal right to inspect the association's records. So I drafted a formal request citing the specific state statutes that guaranteed my access. I didn't just ask for a few documents, I asked for everything. 5 years of detailed financial statements, all bank records, all vendor contracts and invoices, every bid for every project, and the unredacted minutes from every board meeting. I sent the letter via certified mail with a return receipt requested. The signed receipt would be my proof that she had received the demand. A week went by with no response, then 2. On the 15th business day, the legal deadline for a response in our state, another crisp envelope arrived. It wasn't from the HOA, it was from a law firm, Prescott, Davies & Howe. The letter, written on expensive letterhead, informed me that my request was overly broad, burdensome, and intended to harass the board. It stated that they would provide a curated selection of relevant documents within 60 days for which I would be charged a reasonable administrative fee of $500. They were stonewalling, trying to bury me in legal fees and delays. It was time to call in air support. My old friend Marcus Cole had been a JAG officer in the Army before opening his own highly successful private practice. He was sharp, relentless, and had a deep-seated hatred for bullies and abusers of power. I called him that afternoon and laid out the entire situation from the mailbox flag to the attempted towing to the lawyer's letter. He was silent for a long moment after I finished. Then he let out a low whistle. "Jack, you've stumbled into a classic small pond tyrant situation. This woman thinks the HOA is her personal fiefdom, and her lawyer is probably just as crooked." "So what's our move?" I asked. "Our move," Marcus said, and I could hear the grin in his voice, "is to hit them with a sledgehammer. Forget the administrative fees. Forget their 60-day timeline. I'm going to draft a letter that will make their lawyer's hair stand on end. We'll cite statutes about breach of fiduciary duty and fraudulent concealment. We'll give them 10 business days to turn over every single page you requested with no redactions, or we'll file for an immediate injunction and sue the board members personally for damages and legal fees." True to his word, Marcus's letter was a work of art, a masterpiece of legal intimidation. The tone shifted dramatically. 8 days later, a flustered-sounding paralegal from the law firm called me to arrange a time for me to pick up 3 large boxes of documents. There would be no fee. While I waited for the legal gears to turn, I continued my Hearts and Minds campaign within the neighborhood. I spent more time talking to Arthur, who became my unofficial historical advisor. He recounted the story of the Gonzalez family who had been forced to repaint their front door 3 times because Karen kept changing her mind about the approved shade of burgundy. He told me about the elderly Mrs. Gable, who was fined for her bird feeder attracting nuisance squirrels. The stories painted a clear, disturbing pattern of targeted harassment and abuse of power that went back years. My most important new relationship was with the Garcia family, who lived 2 doors down. They were a young couple with 2 small children, and they were terrified of Karen. I saw Mr. Garcia scrubbing chalk drawings off his sidewalk one evening. His shoulders slumped in defeat. I walked over. "Tough day?" I asked gently. He sighed, not looking up. "She sent a notice, said it was graffiti. My 5-year-old drew a flower." He looked up at me, his eyes filled with a mixture of shame and frustration. "We just paid a $100 fine last month because our recycling bin was visible from the street for 2 hours after the truck came. We can't afford this, but we can't afford to fight her either." "I know it's hard," I said, "but you're not alone. She's doing this to a lot of people." I didn't push him, but I let him know he had an ally. I told him I was looking into the HOA's finances and that something wasn't right. I planted a seed of dissent, hoping it would take root. A few days later, the 3 boxes of documents arrived. I cleared my large dining room table, and that weekend it became my command center. I was joined by Sarah, whose keen eye for design and detail was now repurposed for forensic accounting, and Marcus, who came over on a Saturday armed with coffee, donuts, and a stack of yellow legal pads. "All right, Jack," Marcus said, rubbing his hands together as he looked at the mountain of paper. "Let's go hunting." We dug in, and it didn't take long to find what we were looking for. The corruption wasn't even well hidden. It was blatant, arrogant. The truth was worse than I had imagined. The dining room table disappeared under a sea of paper. For 2 days, the only sounds were the rustle of turning pages, the scratch of Marcus's pen on his legal pad, and the occasional sharp intake of breath from Sarah. We were a three-person intelligence unit sifting through years of financial debris for the enemy's signature. Sarah found the first major red flag. "Jack, look at this," she said, her voice tight. She pointed to a series of invoices from a company called Evergreen Landscape Solutions. As a professional landscape designer, she knew the industry inside and out. "These charges are astronomical. They're billing the HOA $900 a month just to mow the small patch of grass at the front entrance. I could get that done for $200 tops." She flipped through more invoices. "And here, a $2,000 charge for seasonal planting. For that price, they should be planting gold-plated tulips. The photos in the community newsletter show they just put in a few flats of common marigolds." Marcus leaned over. "Evergreen Landscape Solution," he read aloud. "Pull the vendor contracts, Jack." I found the folder. The contract had been awarded on a no-bid basis, personally approved by Karen, citing an emergency need to replace the previous landscaper who had failed to perform. The contract had been renewed automatically every year for the past 4 years. "Run a corporate search on Evergreen Landscape Solutions," Marcus instructed. I got on my laptop. A few clicks on the Secretary of State's website gave us the answer. The registered agent and sole officer of the company was a man named Dennis Prescott. "Prescott," I said aloud. "Any relation to Karen?" Marcus grinned, a predator's smile. "Let me guess. Her maiden name wouldn't happen to be Prescott, would it?" He was wrong. A quick social media search revealed something even more damning. Dennis Prescott was Karen's cousin. She wasn't just awarding an overpriced no-bid contract. She was funneling HOA money directly to her own family. This was the smoking gun. But it wasn't the only one. We found invoices for board retreats at a spa 2 hours away, disguised as leadership training seminars. We found thousands of dollars in consulting fees paid to a mysterious LLC with a P.O. box as its only address. The LLC, after more digging by Marcus, turned out to be registered to Karen's sister. The small petty fines she'd levied against residents for chalk drawings and bird feeders weren't about order. They were funding her family's enterprises and her personal spa days. The anger I felt was cold and clean. This wasn't just a power trip anymore. This was fraud. It was time to expand the operation. The following Saturday, I hosted a neighborhood appreciation BBQ. I printed simple, friendly flyers, and Lily helped me deliver them to every house in the subdivision. The flyer made no mention of the HOA. It was just an invitation to get to know your neighbors, with free burgers and hot dogs. I even put one on Karen's door, knowing she wouldn't come but wanting to maintain the illusion of open friendliness. The turnout was better than I expected. The Garcias came, looking nervous but curious. Several other families I recognized from the HOA meetings showed up, along with a handful of others I'd never met. Arthur, of course, was there, holding court by the grill. For the first hour, we just talked. Kids played in the yard, neighbors chatted about schools and work. It felt like the community we'd been promised when we first moved in. After everyone had eaten, I gathered them on the back patio. I kept my tone calm and conversational. "Thanks, everyone, for coming," I started. "When my family and I moved here, we were hoping to be part of a real community. And today feels like we're finally getting there." Then I shifted gears. But I also know that for many of us, living here has become stressful. We've been made to feel like we're constantly breaking some rule we didn't even know existed. I saw heads nodding. The Garcias exchanged a nervous glance. "I've been doing some research into our HOA, as is my right as a homeowner," I continued. I held up a single piece of paper, a summary I had prepared. "I'm not going to bore you with the details, but I want you to know where our money is going." I didn't use the word fraud or embezzlement. I just stated the facts. Last year, our HOA fees, including all fines, totaled over $200,000. Of that, $55,000 was paid to a landscaping company for basic services that industry experts, I nodded towards Sarah, estimate should have cost no more than $20,000. We also paid $12,000 in consulting fees to a company with no employees or business history. The murmur started, quiet at first, then growing louder. "So when you get a $50 fine for leaving your garbage can out for an extra hour," I said, my voice rising slightly, or $100 fine for your child's artwork on the sidewalk. You need to know that your money isn't going to fix the rusty playground or resurface the tennis courts. It's going somewhere else. I looked directly at Mr. Garcia, and it seems the enforcement isn't always applied equally to everyone. Arthur stepped forward. He's right, he said, his professor's voice commanding respect. I've lived here for 30 years. I've watched our community's assets decline while our fees go up. I've seen good people get harassed over nothing. What Jack has uncovered here, it's a disgrace. The fear that had held the neighborhood captive was beginning to crack, replaced by a shared sense of outrage. By the end of the afternoon, we had formed an unofficial Committee for HOA Accountability. We had a dozen families signed up. The seed of dissent I had planted with Mr. Garcia had grown into a garden of rebellion. The alliance was built. Now it was time to set the trap. With a newly emboldened coalition of homeowners behind me, the next phase of the operation began. A petition to recall Karen and her crony board was the ultimate goal, but Marcus advised caution. A recall vote can get messy, he explained over the phone. She'll use procedural tricks, challenge signatures, and try to run out the clock. We need more than just financial evidence. We need to catch her in an act of undeniable public and legally indefensible overreach. We need to make her position so untenable that her own lawyer will advise her to resign. The plan we devised was simple, elegant, and centered on the very thing that had started this war, a vehicle in my driveway. But this time, it wouldn't be my pristine F-250, it would be bait. I spent a few days searching online classifieds until I found the perfect candidate, a 1968 Pontiac GTO convertible. It was a genuine classic, a diamond in the rough. The engine was missing, the interior was shredded, and the body was a patchwork of primer and surface rust. To a casual observer, it was junk. To a car guy, it was a project brimming with potential. To Karen, I hoped it would be an irresistible target. I paid a couple $1,000 for it and had it delivered on a flatbed. We carefully positioned it in my driveway right where the F-250 had been. It was a beautiful eyesore. The next morning, I drafted a letter to the HOA board. I was meticulous. I followed their own procedures for homeowner correspondence to the letter. Dear board members, I wrote, please be advised that I have acquired a classic automobile, a 1968 Pontiac GTO, for the purpose of a personal restoration project. The vehicle will be located on my private property at 112 Willow Lane for the duration of the project, which I estimate will take approximately 12 to 18 months. As per a review of the CC and RS, there are no specific prohibitions against long-term restoration projects undertaken on a homeowner's private driveway. I am providing this notice as a courtesy to the board. I sent it via certified mail. I was building a clear preemptive defense. I wasn't hiding the car. I was declaring my intentions openly and referencing the rulebook. I was daring her to challenge me on shaky legal ground. The reaction was faster and more furious than I could have hoped. Less than 48 hours after she signed for the letter, a new notice was taped to my door. It wasn't the standard violation form, it was a final cease and desist order typed in an angry red font. Your project is in direct violation of CC and R Section F, Paragraph 4, prohibiting the storage of inoperable or junk vehicles in public view, it screamed. The vehicle is an unsightly nuisance and negatively impacts the property values of your neighbors. It gave me 48 hours to remove the wreckage from my property or face maximum daily fines, legal action, and immediate towing and impoundment at the owner's sole expense. She had taken the bait. Hook, line, and sinker. Marcus was ecstatic when I read him the letter. She's a fool. The term junk vehicle is legally vague and subjective. Your letter already established it as a classic vehicle pending restoration. She's walking right into it. Now, we spring the trap. Following Marcus's script, I drafted my response. It was polite, professional, and unyielding. Dear board members, thank you for your correspondence. As previously stated, the vehicle in question is a classic automobile, not a junk vehicle as defined by state motor vehicle laws. as it has a clear title and is considered a collector's item. The CC and RS you cited are vague, and I believe my project is not in violation. I respectfully decline to remove the vehicle from my private property and look forward to enjoying the process of its restoration. Sincerely, Jack Barnes. I sent this one via email, so I had a time-stamped record of her receiving it. I also blind copied Marcus. The digital fuse was lit. The next 48 hours were tense. Every car that drove down our street made Sarah jump. Lily thought the whole thing was epic and kept peeking out the window, hoping for a showdown. I simply went about my business, waiting for the inevitable. The morning of the third day, it happened. I was drinking coffee on my front porch when Karen's car screeched to a halt at the curb. She got out. Wearing a power blue tracksuit this time, her face a mask of grim satisfaction. "Last chance, Mr. Barnes," she called out, her voice loud and carrying, clearly intended for any listening neighbors. "I gave you a final warning. You chose to defy the board. I have Valor Towing on their way right now. The fines for this, plus the impound fees, are going to be substantial. You should have just complied." She was so certain of her victory, so blinded by her own authority that she didn't see the flaw in her plan. She was calling the one company in the city that she had absolutely no power over. "Go ahead, Karen," I said, taking a slow sip of my coffee. My voice was calm, almost gentle. "Do what you think you have to do." Her eyes narrowed at my lack of panic. It confused her, but not enough to make her stop. She was too far gone, too committed to the attack. A few minutes later, the familiar rumble of a heavy-duty diesel engine filled the air. But it wasn't a standard wrecker. It was Dale himself driving our company's flagship, a massive 50-ton rotator crane, the kind used for major highway accidents and semi-truck rollovers. It was absurdly oversized for the job, a piece of deliberate, beautiful overkill. Dale parked this behemoth in the middle of the street, effectively blocking all traffic, and its emergency lights began to flash, bathing the entire cul-de-sac in strobing amber light. Neighbors started coming out of their houses, drawn by the spectacle. Dale got out of the cab wearing his company jacket and walked slowly toward the scene. He was a big man, ex-infantry, with a no-nonsense demeanor that could stop a bar fight with a single look. Karen, momentarily taken aback by the sheer size of the truck, recovered and pointed a triumphant finger at the GTO. "That piece of junk," she commanded. "Haul it out of here, bill it to this address, and add an extra charge for being difficult." Dale looked at the GTO. He looked at me standing on my porch. He looked at the growing audience of neighbors. Then he turned to Karen, his expression as flat and hard as a slab of granite. "Sorry, ma'am," he said, his voice a low growl that cut through the morning air. "Can't do it." Karen's perfectly coiffed world tilted on its axis. The triumphant smirk she wore dissolved, replaced by a slack-jawed confusion that quickly hardened into rage. "What do you mean you can't do it?" she sputtered, her voice rising in pitch. "I am the president of this homeowners association. I have a service contract with your company. You are legally obligated to remove this vehicle when I order it." The audience of neighbors was growing. The Garcias were on their front lawn, holding hands. Old Arthur was standing by his mailbox, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across his face. This was no longer a private dispute. It was a public spectacle. Dale stood his ground, unmoving. He was used to dealing with frantic people at accident scenes, and Karen's tirade didn't faze him in the slightest. "Ma'am, with all due respect, my obligation is to my company," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And my company is telling me not to touch that car." He gestured with his thumb back towards the massive rotator. "I'm the operations manager and 49% owner of Valor Towing." He then pointed a thick finger directly at me, still standing on my porch. "And he's the silent partner, the 51% majority owner. The man who signs my paychecks just got off the phone with me and gave me a direct, legally binding order as my superior. Stand down and do not, under any circumstances, lay a finger on his property." The reveal landed like a physical blow. You could see the information processing behind Karen's eyes, the frantic search for an explanation, the dawning horror of the truth. She had not only failed to intimidate me, she had done so using my own company, and she had done it in front of half the neighborhood. The sheer beautiful irony of the situation was lost on her, but not on the onlookers. A few people gasped. Someone snickered. That's a conflict of interest, and she finally managed to stammer, pointing a trembling finger at me. That's illegal! You can't do that! It was time for me to join the conversation. I walked down the steps of my porch and stood on my lawn, closing the distance between us. I held up the sheaf of papers I had been waiting to use. The evidence from the HOA's own files. Is it a conflict of interest, Karen? I asked, my voice carrying clearly across the lawns. Is it a conflict of interest for me to prevent my own company from illegally towing my own legally owned property from my own private land? I took a step closer. Or is the real conflict of interest you, the HOA president, awarding a $55,000 a year no-bid landscaping contract to a company owned by your cousin, Dennis Prescott? I held up the corporate filing with his name on it. A wave of murmurs rippled through the crowd of neighbors. Is the conflict of interest the $12,000 in consulting fees you paid to a shell company owned by your sister? I held up another document. Is it the board retreats at a luxury spa that you paid for with our money? Karen's face had gone from red to a pasty, sickly white. She was trapped, exposed, her carefully constructed authority crumbling around her in real time. She looked from the papers in my hand to the faces of her neighbors, and for the first time she saw not fear or deference, but contempt. You want to talk about rules, Karen? I pressed on, my voice like steel. Let's talk about the rules you broke. Let's talk about breach of fiduciary duty. Let's talk about mail fraud and embezzlement. Those are the rules the district attorney is going to be very interested in. The mention of the DA was the final straw. Her bluster, her arrogance, her entire persona shattered. She looked like a cornered animal. She opened her mouth to speak, but only a choked, gurgling sound came out. She shot a venomous glare at me, then at Dale, then at the assembled neighbors. Without another word she turned, her movements clumsy and panicked, and practically ran to her car. She fumbled with the keys, dropped them, picked them up, and finally managed to get the door open. She threw herself inside and sped away, leaving a trail of tire squeal and utter humiliation in her wake. A stunned silence hung over the street for a moment, broken only by the flashing lights of Dale's rotator. Then someone started to clap. It was Mr. Garcia. His wife joined in, then another neighbor, and another. Soon, the entire street was applauding. Dale walked over to me, a huge grin breaking across his face. Well, he said, clapping me on the shoulder, I think that went pretty well. You want me to leave the rotator here for a few hours? For ambiance? I laughed. A genuine, relieved laugh. No, get that thing out of here before it cracks the pavement. But Dale, thank you. Don't thank me, he said, gesturing to the neighbors who were now walking toward us, their faces alight with excitement and relief. Looks to me like you just liberated a whole country. The trap had been sprung. The queen had been dethroned in the most public way imaginable. But the war wasn't over. Now came the reckoning. The story of Karen's spectacular public downfall spread through Oakwood Preserve faster than a brush fire. The image of Dale's massive rotator blocking the street, Karen's sputtering rage, and my calm presentation of her financial misdeeds became instant neighborhood legend. The oppressive spell of fear she had cast over the community for years was broken. That afternoon, my doorbell rang constantly. Neighbors I had never spoken to came by to shake my hand, to thank me, to share their own stories of Karen's petty tyranny. The Garcias brought over a bottle of wine, their faces beaming with a relief that was profound. We never thought anyone could stand up to her, Mrs. Garcia said, her voice thick with emotion. You gave everyone their voice back. The Committee for HOA Accountability swelled overnight from 12 families to more than 60. The petition Marcus had drafted for the recall of Karen and her two board cronies, Carol and Bob, collected the necessary signatures in a single evening. People were practically lining up at my door to sign it. Marcus, ever the strategist, didn't just file the petition with the now powerless board. He simultaneously filed all the necessary paperwork with the county clerk and a formal request with a local arbitration service to oversee a special election, completely bypassing Karen's ability to obstruct or delay. He called for an emergency meeting of the homeowners to be held the following week at the community clubhouse. Karen and her lawyer made a last-ditch effort to stop it, claiming the petition was invalid and the meeting was procedurally improper. Marcus shut them down with a single blistering legal filing that not only affirmed our position but also included a motion to have Karen's lawyer sanctioned for filing a frivolous objection. The meeting was set. The atmosphere in the clubhouse on the night of the meeting was electric. It was standing room only. Residents packed the room, lining the walls and spilling out into the hallway. This wasn't the usual sparsely attended, soul-crushing monthly meeting. This was a tribunal. Karen, Carol, and Bob sat at the front table, looking small and isolated. Karen attempted a look of defiance, but her eyes were panicked, and she fidgeted constantly with a pen. Carol looked like she was about to burst into tears, while Bob just looked more asleep than usual. At Marcus's suggestion, we had arranged for a neutral third party to preside over the meeting, a retired judge who lived in the neighborhood and had been one of the first to sign the recall petition. This stripped Karen of her usual power to control the microphone and the agenda. The judge called the meeting to order, his voice calm and authoritative. "This is a special meeting called for the purpose of a recall vote for the current board members," he announced. "Before the vote, Mr. Marcus Cole, representing a committee of homeowners, will present the basis for the recall." Marcus walked to the podium, carrying a thick binder. He didn't raise his voice or engage in theatrics. He simply and methodically laid out the case, using a projector to display the documents for everyone to see. He started with the Evergreen Landscape Solutions contract. He showed the invoices, the no-bid award, and the corporate filing proving it was owned by Karen's cousin. He presented Sarah's expert analysis, showing a clear pattern of overbilling that had cost the homeowners over $100,000 in 4 years. Next, he showed the receipts for the leadership seminars at the spa and the consulting fees paid to Karen's sister's shell company. With each slide, a low, angry murmur grew in the room. He then presented affidavits from a dozen families, including the Garcias, detailing the pattern of harassment, the selective enforcement, and the exorbitant, arbitrary fines. He showed how the money from those fines, money taken from families for trivial violations, was directly funneled into the accounts that paid for Karen's self-dealing schemes. When Marcus was finished, the judge turned to Karen. "Mrs. Prescott, you have the floor for a rebuttal." Karen stood up, her hands shaking. She launched into a desperate, rambling tirade. She accused me of having a personal vendetta. She claimed I was a disruptive force who had moved into their perfect community and was trying to tear it down. She painted herself as a devoted volunteer, working tirelessly to protect their property values, only to be attacked and vilified. "He's the bully!" she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. "He and his big ugly truck and his big ugly tow company, he's trying to take over." But her words were hollow. The residents weren't listening to her accusations. They were looking at the evidence projected on the screen behind her. They had lived her reality. They had paid her fines. They had endured her harassment. Her victim act was met with cold silence and angry stares. When she finally ran out of steam and sat down, the judge let the silence hang in the air for a moment before speaking. "We will now proceed to the vote," he said. "All in favor of the recall of Karen Prescott, Carol Ann Miller, and Robert Chen from the Board of Directors, please stand." In a single unified motion, the entire room rose to its feet. It was a wave of silent, powerful condemnation. Only 3 people remained seated, Karen, Carol, and Bob. The judge looked around the room. "And all opposed?" The 3 of them didn't even bother to raise their hands. "The motion carries," the judge announced, his voice ringing with finality. "The board is hereby recalled, effective immediately." A wave of cheers and applause erupted, a cathartic release of years of pent-up frustration. Karen sat frozen for a moment, her face a blank mask of shock before grabbing her purse and storming out of the clubhouse, pushing past the very residents she had once terrorized. The Queen had not only been dethroned, she had been exiled. The ousting of Karen and her board was a moment of pure communal triumph, but I knew the job wasn't finished. Justice wasn't just about removing a tyrant. It was about repairing the damage and ensuring it could never happen again. In the same meeting, the retired judge immediately called for nominations for an interim board. The neighborhood, now united and energized, quickly nominated and elected Arthur Kensington as the new president. A man who had seen the community's best and worst days, he was the perfect choice to guide its restoration. His first official act, proposed from the floor and passed by a unanimous roar of approval, was to declare all outstanding fines levied by the previous board null and void. His second was to draft a motion to hire an independent forensic accountant to conduct a full audit of the last 5 years of the HOA's finances. The era of the clipboard was over. The era of transparency had begun. But my personal mission wasn't complete. Marcus and I met the following week. The recall was a civil matter between homeowners, he explained, but the evidence we uncovered points to criminal activity. We have a moral and legal obligation to see this through. On behalf of the newly constituted HOA, Marcus filed a comprehensive civil lawsuit against Karen, her cousin Dennis, and her sister, seeking to recoup every last dollar they had siphoned from the community. The lawsuit detailed the fraudulent landscaping contracts, the bogus consulting fees, and the personal use of HOA funds. Simultaneously, we compiled our entire investigation, every invoice, every bank statement, every email, and every affidavit, into a thick, meticulously organized binder. Marcus hand-delivered it to the Economic Crimes Unit of the local district attorney's office. The wheels of a much larger and more formidable bureaucracy than Karen's little HOA began to turn. Life in Oakwood Preserve began to change, slowly at first, then all at once. The oppressive atmosphere of surveillance lifted. People started talking to each other more. Kids' chalk drawings reappeared on sidewalks and were left there to be admired. A new brightly colored swing set, funded by a newly transparent budget, was installed at the park. Arthur, as president, led a complete overhaul of the CC and RS. Vague, subjective rules were clarified or eliminated. The process for violations was made fair and transparent, with an emphasis on neighborly conversation before written notices. The power to levy fines was strictly curtailed and placed in the hands of a 5-person committee, not a single individual. The HOA was being transformed from an instrument of control into a tool for genuine community building. Months passed. The civil suit moved forward. Faced with irrefutable evidence, Karen's family members quickly settled, agreeing to repay a significant portion of the money they had received. Karen herself, however, held out, buried under mounting legal fees and a misguided belief in her own victimhood. Then one Tuesday morning, the news broke. Karen Prescott had been indicted by a grand jury on multiple felony counts, including fraud, theft by deception, and embezzlement. Her mugshot, a stark, unglamorous photo under harsh fluorescent lights, was on the local news website. A few weeks later, a for sale sign appeared on her lawn. The sign had a large red banner across the top that read, "Motivated Seller." The house sold quickly, for less than she'd hoped. The neighborhood she had ruled with an iron fist had cast her out completely. The final scene of this long campaign didn't take place in a courtroom or a clubhouse, but right back where it all started, my driveway. It was a perfect Saturday afternoon, nearly a year after the Great Tow Truck Showdown. The 1968 GTO was no longer a rusted hulk, but a gleaming masterpiece of automotive art. I had spent the winter rebuilding the engine and the spring restoring the body. Its new coat of tiger gold paint shimmered in the sun. Sarah was planting a new bed of defiant, non-regulation colored lilies along the walkway, humming to herself. Our daughter, Lily, was shooting hoops with the Garcia kids at the basketball hoop, which remained exactly where I had first placed it. I was sitting on the lowered tailgate of my F-250 polishing a piece of chrome trim when Arthur walked up my driveway. He wasn't carrying a clipboard or a violation notice. He was carrying 2 bottles of cold beer. "Figured you earned one of these," he said, handing me a bottle. He sat down on the tailgate next to me. We sat in comfortable silence for a moment, looking out at the neighborhood. The street was alive. Neighbors were out gardening. Kids were riding bikes. A friendly game of catch was happening across the street. The quiet I had sought when I moved here was no longer the tense, fearful silence of before. It was a genuine, earned peace. "You know," Arthur said, taking a sip of his beer, "and for 30 years I taught history. I taught about revolutions, about how small acts of defiance can topple empires. I have to admit, seeing it happen in my own neighborhood with a tow truck and a GTO. It's been the best lesson of my retirement." He raised his bottle in a toast. "To Valor Towing," he said, a broad grin on his face. I clinked my bottle against his, the sound a small, satisfying chime in the peaceful afternoon air. "To neighbors," I replied. The mission was accomplished. The peace had been secured, and it was better than I had ever imagined.